The file in front of you was never officially closed. The investigators moved on. The witnesses stopped talking. The leads ran dry, but the case never closed. What you are about to hear has been documented. The timeline, the evidence, the questions that were never answered. Welcome to case number unknown. Let's open the file. On a freezing February night in 1978, 5 young men drove into the mountains of Northern California after a college basketball game. Their car was found abandoned on a remote mountain road, 70 miles from where they should have been. Months later, the remains of 4 of them were discovered in and around a Forest Service trailer, stocked with food, heating supplies, and survival gear they barely touched. The 5th man was never found. This is the story of the Yuba County Five, one of the most confounding disappearances in American history, and a case that has haunted investigators for nearly half a century. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand who these men were. Gary Mathias, age 25, was a Vietnam veteran who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but was described as stable and doing well on his medication. Jack Madruga, age 30, was the oldest of the group and the owner of the car they drove that night, a turquoise 1969 Mercury Montego. Theodore Weiher, age 32, was a gentle and quiet man who lived with his mother. William Sterling, age 29, and Jack Hewitt, age 24, rounded out the group. All 5 men had varying degrees of intellectual and developmental disabilities, but they were close friends, bonded by their shared love of basketball. They played together on a team sponsored by a local program for adults with special needs, and they were good. In fact, they were preparing for a tournament of their own, scheduled for the very next day. On the evening of February 24, 1978, the 5 men piled into Madruga's Mercury to drive from Yuba City to Chico, California, roughly a 50-mile trip south on Highway 70, to watch a UC Davis basketball game at the Chico State Gymnasium. It was a routine outing. They arrived at the game, watched it, and appeared to enjoy themselves. Witnesses confirmed seeing them in the arena. The game ended around 10 p.m. After the game, they stopped briefly at a convenience store, where a clerk remembered them buying snacks. They were described as being in good spirits. At this point, everything was normal. Then something went terribly wrong. Instead of driving south back to Yuba City, the Mercury Montego was later found heading north on the Oroville-Quincy Highway, a treacherous mountain road that led deep into the Plumas National Forest. This road climbs to over 4,000 feet in elevation. In late February, the mountains were blanketed in snow. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. There was absolutely no logical reason for these 5 men to be on that road. None of them had any known connections to the area. None of them had expressed a desire to go there. They had a basketball tournament the next morning. They should have been heading home. The car was found 5 days later, on March 1st, by a group of forest rangers at an elevation of roughly 4,000 feet, parked on the side of the road near a snowbank. The vehicle was in perfect working condition. The gas tank was a quarter full. There were no signs of mechanical failure, no signs of a struggle, no signs of damage. The windows were rolled up. The keys were not in the ignition. Inside the car, investigators found candy bar wrappers from the snacks they had purchased. But the 5 men were gone. The discovery of the car raised immediate alarm. Search and rescue teams mobilized, but heavy snow hampered their efforts for weeks. The terrain was brutal, steep mountain forest covered in feet of snow, with temperatures that made prolonged exposure deadly. Helicopters were deployed. Ground teams with dogs scoured the surrounding wilderness. But February turned into March, and March into April, and no trace of the 5 men was found. Then, in June of 1978, as the snow finally began to melt, a motorcyclist traveling through the forest discovered remains. What investigators found next would only deepen the mystery. Approximately 19 miles from the abandoned car, at a Forest Service trailer used by snowbound rangers, they found the bodies of Theodore Weiher and a set of remains that would eventually be identified as belonging to Jack Hewitt and William Sterling. Wyher's body was found inside the trailer itself. He was lying on a bed, wrapped in sheets. He had lost significant weight, an estimated 80 to 100 pounds. His feet showed severe frostbite, and it was determined he had survived for an astonishing 8 to 13 weeks after the night they disappeared, wasting away slowly in that isolated trailer. Here is where the case becomes truly inexplicable. The Forest Service trailer was stocked with provisions. There were canned goods, including sea rations. There were matches and a propane heater with a full tank of fuel. There were warm blankets and heavy clothes. Enough supplies existed to sustain multiple people for a significant period. Yet the heater was never turned on. The sea rations, apart from a few opened cans, were largely untouched. It was as though the men were either unable or unwilling to use the supplies that could have saved their lives. Wyher had apparently managed to wrap himself in bedsheets, but did not light the heater that stood only feet from where he lay dying. The remains of Sterling and Hewitt were found outside the trailer at varying distances, partially consumed by animals and exposed to months of weather. Jack Madruga's body was found separately, roughly 11 miles from the car, along what appeared to be the route between the Mercury and the trailer. He had apparently collapsed during the hike through the snow. His cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. But the fifth man, Gary Mathias, the one with military training, the one with a history of mental illness, was never found. His shoes were discovered inside the trailer, neatly placed beside the bed. A gold watch belonging to him was also recovered. But of Gary Mathias himself, there was no trace. Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. He simply vanished. Investigators were left with a cascade of unanswered questions. The most fundamental was this: why were they on that mountain road in the first place? The route they took made no geographic sense. One theory centered on a man named Joseph Scarns, a local resident who told investigators he had been stranded on the same road that night with car trouble. Scarns claimed he saw headlights approach around midnight and called out for help. He said the lights stopped, and then he heard voices, but instead of helping, the car turned around and drove further up the mountain. Scarns suffered a mild heart attack that night and was later rescued by other passers-by. Investigators wondered if the five men had encountered Scarns and, for reasons unknown, became frightened and drove deeper into the mountains. But this theory raises more questions than it answers. Why would a request for help scare them into driving further up a frozen mountain road? And even if they panicked momentarily, why not simply turn around and drive back down? Another theory suggests they were followed or chased. Supporters of this theory point to the seemingly irrational decisions the men made, abandoning a working vehicle, hiking 19 miles through snow at night, and failing to use available survival resources. These actions, some argue, are consistent with men who were terrified, fleeing from a perceived or real threat. But no evidence of another party was ever found near the car or the trailer. Gary Mathias is at the center of the darkest theory. Some investigators quietly speculated that Mathias, whose schizophrenia had in previous years led to at least one violent incident before he was stabilized on medication, may have suffered a psychotic break that night. In this scenario, his erratic behavior could have confused and frightened the other four men, who would have been ill-equipped to handle such a situation in a remote, freezing environment. His military training might explain why he survived longer than the others, or it might explain how he walked away from that trailer and disappeared into the wilderness forever. But the families of all five men have consistently rejected this theory, insisting that Mathias was stable, kind, and devoted to his friends. The families also pointed out something that investigators could never adequately explain. These were men who, by all accounts, followed routines rigidly. They were creatures of habit. They were excited about their basketball tournament. The idea that they would voluntarily deviate from their plan, drive into unknown mountains in the dead of winter, without telling anyone, was fundamentally inconsistent with everything their families knew about them. As of today, The case of the Yuba County Five remains officially unsolved. Gary Mathias has never been found, dead or alive. No arrests have ever been made. No definitive explanation has been offered for why five friends drove into the frozen Sierra Nevada mountains on a night when they had every reason to go home. The Forest Service trailer where they suffered and died has become a monument to one of the most baffling missing persons cases in California history. So what happened on that mountain road in February of 1978? Were they chased by someone who was never identified? Did one of them suffer a mental health crisis that sent the entire group spiraling into disaster? Or is there an explanation so simple and so tragic that we have been overthinking it all along? After more than 4 decades, the mountains have not given up their secrets. And somewhere in the Plumas National Forest, the answer may still be buried under the snow. The investigation is ongoing. If you have a case you think deserves a file, leave it in the comments. New files open every week. Subscribe, because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it takes.